The US and Israel have often portrayed themselves as secular democracies fighting against a theocratic Islamic regime in Iran. But recently, US leaders have spoken of a biblical duty to defend Israel. Military commanders have referenced divine destiny, and Israeli leaders continue to cite biblical claims to territory. So why is religious rhetoric resurfacing now, and what happens when faith, nationalism and politics collide on the global stage? For more, I'm joined by Melani McAlister, author and professor of American Studies and International Affairs at George Washington University, and Shaul Magid, rabbi and professor of modern Judaism at Harvard Divinity School. Thank you both for joining me. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
Melani, let me start with you. We've heard statements from US government officials and also members of Congress calling the Iran war a religious war. And they also say that the US has a biblical responsibility to protect Israel against Iran. Now, how do you interpret this invocation of Christianity and the Bible in framing this war?
Well, thank you for having me. And it's certainly not the first time that American Christians have called on the Bible to justify or support various kinds of political action. But what we're seeing now is an intensified access of a range of very conservative Christians to the White House and a lot of representation in Congress. So this is going to the very heights of power.
I just want you to take a listen and a look at this little clip from the White House last week. Let's have a look.
We pray for wisdom from heaven to flood his heart, his mind, and the Lord, you will guide him in these challenging times that we're facing today. I pray for your grace and your protection over him. Yes. I pray for your grace and protection over our troops and all of our men and women serving in our armed forces.
Okay, so we were in the Oval Office for a moment there. They are praying for the president, for wisdom, for protection during these difficult times. The US, Melani, has had evangelical presidents before, even as there is this avowed principle of the separation of church and state. How different is this political moment to past public demonstrations of faith?
You're certainly right that having pastors of different denominations praying over a president is certainly not new. And we have had presidents, Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush, both of whom claimed an evangelical faith of a type. And so that is not what's new. What's new is that the far right of American evangelicalism is a very broad movement that includes people of all races and maybe as much as 25% of the US population. What we're talking about here is the far right of that movement, newly organized and energized around a few key figures and institutions that are mobilizing to try to push their agenda of having more and more power in the secular world, and they're doing that very successfully under President Trump.
Shaul, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, in a recent interview seemed to agree with the idea that Israel has a biblical right to all the land between the Nile River in Egypt and the Euphrates River in Iraq. He said, quote, "It would be fine if they took it all." I just want to talk about the concept of Greater Israel here. It is one that is espoused by leaders in Israel as well, in the government. In what ways does this war on Iran reflect a belief in the concept of the Greater Israel?
When Ambassador Huckabee talks about the Nile, from the Nile to Euphrates, he's really talking about something he's talking about something biblical. He's talking about the borders of the Solomonic kingdom, that is the kingdom of King Solomon, which did extend far up close to the Euphrates and extended to the Nile. But generally, when people talk about Greater Israel in Israel, or certainly in the Israeli political world, they're not talking about an expansion of Israel from the Nile to Euphrates. They're talking about the extended state of Israel from the Jordan River into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, it is also true, it's worth noting that not only Ambassador Huckabee, but Yair Lapid, who is a center-left Israeli politician who was against the prime minister, against Netanyahu, also recently came out and talked about the biblical borders of Israel. And when someone talks about the biblical borders of Israel, that's closer to that expansionist notion of the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, again, he wasn't necessarily saying that Israel should, conquer Lebanon and go into Iraq, but it's kind of the way in which the secular state of Israel is always in a complicated relationship with the religious tradition and with the biblical tradition, and it really kind of goes back and forth between, on the one hand, being a secular state, being a member nation of the United Nations, and also seeing itself as the fulfillment of some kind of biblical promise, which, at least in theory, would extend the borders beyond where they are now.
I want to talk about the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. He wrote a book called American Crusade. It depicts Islam as an enemy of the West. He cites scripture during Pentagon briefings, praised and invited a pastor who identifies as a Christian nationalist. That's Douglas Wilson. I wonder what it means to have a figure like Hegseth in charge of defense and who holds this particular position on Israel.
There are many disturbing things about Pete Hegseth, but I would highlight his deep anti-Muslim commitments. He has a Crusader cross tattooed on his chest. He had the word kafir, infidel, tattooed on his arm. He is a person who is animated by anti-Muslim sentiment, great hostility towards Muslims, who he sees as a great competitor to Christianity. And in that sense, his Christianity is not just Christian nationalism, which it certainly is, but it's a kind of global vision animated since the end of communism of Christians in a fight for adherence, for control, for power against Muslims, not just in the US, but really worldwide.
Mm-hmm. And Shaul, what can you tell us about the Israeli army? I mean, are religious connotations and symbols used prominently in that military as well?
They are increasingly, and there is a debate in Israel whether those kinds of patches or insignia should really be used. I mean, the army now has become predominantly an army of religious nationalist Jews, especially in the officers' corps. So it's really turning into a much more nationalist, messianic force that's actually, involved in adjudicating disagreements or violence between Palestinians and Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and it's really a very troubling turn. I think that Israel is becoming, even though it remains a secular state, it's becoming a much more religious nationalist state in terms of its ethos, and I think that filters down into the army, and that's why you see settlers getting away with violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And the army not intervening. So it's a very complicated and I think a very volatile situation, and a turn of events that I think has the potential, especially when you add in Pete Hegseth and Mike Huckabee, you actually have a kind of triangle whereas in the medieval world you had it was Christendom and Dar al-Islam, and now you have the Jews who are another power broker who enter into that and have become an extension in some way of the Christian nationalist religious vision, which in a certain sense adds to the animus that's being created in the Muslim world, because ultimately Israel is living in a Muslim part of the world.
A personal question to you both. Melani, you grew up a Southern Baptist evangelical. You learned the importance of exactly what you've been describing, the importance of Israel to Christianity at a young age. And Shaul, you are a rabbi. I didn't state that when you started. You've said you became religious when you were 20 and initially lived in this ultra-Orthodox world and served in the Israeli army. From personal experience, both of you, what is it like to be drawn to nationalist religious ideology? And what can you tell us about your journey to wean yourself from that? I'll start with you, Melani.
Well, I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I was an evangelical for sure, but not a nationalist one. Christian nationalism did not have that kind of pull when I was young. But what I did find very difficult to leave was the very narrow ways that morality is described and what is right and what is wrong. And that's what we're seeing today with the discussion about Iran, where this is what God has said you're supposed to do, and you can't really argue with that if you buy what this pastor is saying. So that piece where God is behind, every single thing that happens in daily life and every political event leaves a lot of politics on the floor. And so that's really what ultimately my desire to be able to have an impact on and think about making the world a better place was what led me away.
And Shaul, how did you go from where you were to where you are now?
Well, that's a long story, but in short, I mean, my entry into the Jewish religious world was really entry into an ultra-Orthodox world that wasn't nationalist and wasn't really even Zionist. And when I decided to immigrate to Israel, I was really immigrating to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, as it were, and less to the state. I mean, over time, I became kind of, in a sense, enamored by a particular kind of romantic vision of Zionism at that time, which is a very long time ago. It's a little bit different now than it was then. I mean, I think that I started to recognize the real kind of, for me, what was the incompatibility of that world, serving in the First Intifada in the army in the West Bank. And I saw firsthand what it was to dominate another people. And I recognized that this can't sustain itself. This is not ethically or morally legitimate. And I felt, in a certain sense, that I was, I saw the hatred in the eyes of the children toward me. And the truth is they had every reason in the world to hate me because I was dominating their life. So I think that was the beginning of a crack for me that opened up between this romantic vision of the restoration of the Jews to the homeland or to the Holy Land or to the land of Israel, and the recognition that there are another people living there who have lived there for a long time, who deserve the same kind of right of self-determination that I do. And I felt it was problematic that my self-determination had to come by denying the self-determination of another people.
Shaul, Magid, Melani, McAlister, thank you both so much for being generous with your insights and your personal journeys as well. Thank you.
Nice to be here.
That's our show. Up Front. We'll be back next week. Goodbye.